All right, so welcome. We've got something really exciting to talk about today, which is substantial equivalence, which on the face of it might not sound all that interesting, but we have a living, breathing example of substantial equivalence here in Kate. Kate is a freshly minted clinical psychologist, which I say freshly minted. She's actually been a psychologist for over 2 decades, but she comes from the Ed and Dev pathway. So Kate has an Ed and Dev background training and does not have Clinical Masters, but as of very late last year, Kate, or was it
early January.
Early January this year, she has become a clinical psychologist via the substantial equivalence pathway. So for those of you who don't know about the substantial equivalence pathway, it's relatively new. As you would be aware, there's been this ongoing battle in psychology over the 2-tier system. And as many of you would be aware of, there were a number of people who, when the gates shut to being in the clinical psychology pathway, they felt that they had been unfairly excluded from that pathway. Historically, didn't matter so much. It just meant that you got an extra magazine from the APS. Suddenly, when we throw an extra 50% rebate for Medicare, that distinction between clinical and non-clinical actually really matters. There's been an ongoing battle for that in psychology, but importantly, in the legal front, the Australian Association of Psychologists Incorporated, AAPI, funded some legal action. And one of the most important legal cases that was taken was a case called Coulter versus the Psychology Board of Australia. Dr. Coulter had a long, substantial equivalence training as a clinical psychologist, and she argued that what had happened to her, whereby her clinical training, even though it was clinical training, it wasn't called a clinical master's. She argued that she should be able to access clinical psychology. The board rejected that. They took it to VCAT, which is the Victorian Civil and Administrative Appeals Tribunal, and Coulter, and funded by the AAPI, was successful in that bid. So the board not only had to give her clinical psychology status. Once you open the door, that has a precedent. So they very rapidly had to develop this thing called the substantial equivalence pathway, so that people who have met the requirements of clinical psychology, but who didn't come through one of the traditional pathways, are now able to get that equivalence and that endorsement as clinical psychologists. And as I said earlier, Kate is a living, breathing example of this, someone who not all that long ago met the requirements for being a clinical psychologist, but was unable to get that clinical endorsement. And I should, full disclosure, Kate and I know each other because she's working with us on the PrEP program, and she's helping us develop the educational and developmental pathway, which is something we're really excited about for Ed and Dev registrars. Kate, can I throw over to you? Tell me a little bit about, first off, your story. What's your clinical background? What's your professional background? How did you manage to miss out on that?
Well, as you said, I've been a psychologist for coming up to 25 years now. I did an Education Developmental Masters, 2001, 2002, which was pre-APRA.
Yep.
In Victoria, we didn't have regulated titles for anything apart from psychologist. Yeah. So all the other titles, I'm aware that Western Australia had clinical psychologist as a specialisation.
Yeah, WA had a specialisation, but we were the same in Queensland. We had, psychologists and provisional psychologists. Yeah. They were our 2 categories.
Yeah. And in order to, I grandfathered as an education developmental psychology, again, for transparency, the grandfather terminology. And I had inklings prior to APRA coming in that there would be this transition period where if you were a college member, you would be able to get your endorsement, I guess, whatever they were going to call it. So 2009, I put my application into the APS with a little bit of backwards and forwards. They accepted my application for membership of the CEDP, and then that transition.
CEDP.
Good. College of Educational and Developmental Psychology.
Thank you very much.
Good job. So I, became an Ed and Dev with the transition to APRA. So it was only a few years after the 2-tier stuff happened.
Can I be dumb? If you'd applied for clinical at that point in time, would it have, Like
Yes.
when I have a clinical PhD,
Yep.
but when I applied for, as it was, membership of the clinical college, it was just pay your extra $50.
Yep.
It was almost like signing up for a newsletter at that
Yeah.
particular point in time. If you'd applied for clinical in, I think you said 2005, 2009, would you have got it then, or?
My understanding at the time, which I have since heard, was in order to become a clinical college member, you had to demonstrate that you'd done some extra PD in psychopharmacology.
Right, okay.
So I don't believe that I would have had to have a clinical master's. I do know other people who grandfathered at the same time who were able to get clinical psychology from grandfathering without much in the way of training, but I don't know for sure exactly what that looks like. I've only heard rumors.
No, and again, it's interesting. We've got this kind of oral history, and it feels like the pathway went very rapidly from pay you $50 to pay you $50 and show us your academic transcripts to pay you $50 academic transcripts plus substantial equivalence. And by the time they shut it, it was $50 academic transcripts, substantial equivalence. And by the way, are you a professor of clinical psychology? And like, it was very much.
And I agree. I think that it happened pretty quickly, because even in the Education Developmental College, they had, I remember filling out the form. In fact, I found the form I filled out in my electronic paperwork, and
Fantastic.
You had two options. You had the option of having demonstrated a period of supervised practice in order to, or you had to show that you'd done substantial PD.
Yeah.
So I went with I'd done substantial PD in the ed and dev space. They did come back to me and say, oh, you haven't got any supervision. And my response to them was, oh, the form said I had these two options. And then they approved it.
Got it. So then for the last, and I'll round up a little bit, but for the last 20 years, you've been an educational developmental psychologist. You've been working in educational, school, a variety of settings. Presuming, and I don't know enough about your career history, but presuming that you were working in private practice, your clients were disadvantaged by the rebate. In a school setting, the clinical thing probably doesn't make a lot of difference. In a lot of settings, it doesn't. But in that private practice setting, under the two-tier system of Medicare, your clients got the lower rebate. My clients got the higher rebate.
And how it tended to play, or how it tends to play out for psychologists, is that there ends up being two different, the same fee. So the clinical psychologist and the ed and dev psychologist, or any other psychologist, will be, let's round it up to say they charge $250.
Whatever.
Everybody's charged out at $250. The clinical psychologists, the rebate for clients will be higher, and the rebate for everybody else will be lower. And so what ends up happening, particularly for contractors, is the contractors get a lower fee.
Yeah.
Because the gap for the client is the same, but that tends to be.
Or certainly how it played out in our practice was very much, not so much that people got a lower fee, but it was harder to fill their books because, a client is going, well, I've got to pay X to see you, or I can pay X plus, $50 or whatever.
And that's why a lot of the clinics, like when I've worked at, there was one clinic I worked at where everyone was just a flat fee, so that they didn't have that issue. The gap would be the same regardless of which clinician you got. That just meant that they didn't have trouble filling the books. So
absolutely.
At the same time, as you say, Medicare actually hasn't featured that much in my career. I've worked primarily in schools, and when I've worked in private practice, I've mostly done assessment. It's featured a little bit here and there, but it often is playing out. And the reason why I went for substantial equivalence in the end was because of NDIS.
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
NDIS has shifted the ball game in what they are expecting of people, and they are wanting clinical psychologists to sign off on reports. And so what it will mean as an education developmental psychologist, who my primary key work is neurodevelopmental disorder assessments, that is my bread and butter.
That's your work. Yeah,
that's what I do. And I have 25 years experience nearly doing that. They would be, and it hasn't happened so much to me, but it has happened to a lot of my supervisees, that they will get the pushback from NDIS saying, sorry, you're not a clinical psychologist. Your report is not regarded, basically, not in those words, but
No,
you need to get clinical psych sign off.
Yeah. Well, which, and again, I don't want to get into the politics of this.
No.
It's bonkers that I could sign off on your report where, you were infinitely more qualified in doing that work, but, I'm sitting here with a particular guy. Anyway, I really appreciate that sort of potted career history. And I think this is why the Coulter case is so important, in that if this was 3 years ago and the same thing happened and there was no substantial equivalence, like that, that is a landmark case that has changed the face of psychology, registration, endorsement, et cetera, et cetera. I can't remember the exact timing, but it feels like about 18 months ago that the board...
Yeah, I think you're right. It was about 18 months ago.
The actual paperwork and pathway. How did you become aware of that? Was it through AAPI or APS or through your friends?
Actually, just through colleagues, AADPA colleagues, actually.
Yeah, got it.
So,
hang on, AADPA,
Australian Educational Developmental Psychology Association. So me with two of my mates. Give us
a plug. Tell us who you guys are. What do you do? We can stick a link down below, and we'll stick a link to the Coulter case down in the video description too. Tell us about AEDPA.
So AEDPA started because we wanted to do some advocacy. So me and two friends, basically colleagues who'd worked together for a while, decided that we would found an association specific for educational developmental psychology. So I really identify as an educational developmental psychologist. That's my primary bread and butter. One of them was, found out about this, and it was all kind of on the works anyway. We'd heard things around the traps. I remember the conversation going, you should apply for this, Kate. And I'm like, I'm not going to get through. I really felt like I didn't have what was going to be required. And then they went through and they got it. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And I thought, well, maybe they've done a little bit more in, some things that I haven't done. And so, primarily my training in particular was primarily child focused. So from a lifespan competency, my placements weren't, as I perceived at the time, clinical enough. And it wasn't until I started unpacking things that I thought, oh, there's more here than I realized. Anyway, so they went and did it, and then I started to see other people going through the trap. So when you start seeing other people and you're like, hang on a second, if they've got it, maybe I can get it. And then, middle of last year is when I started thinking about it.
Really fascinating that you mentioned that threshold thing, because and again, this was an off-the-record conversation that I had with somebody who would know, but the feedback that I got was, back in the day, the board was coming from a position of almost the onus of proof was on, you need to justify why you get substantial equivalence. With and I don't mean to overplay this, but I think it was embarrassing for the board to have their decision overturned in a VCAT hearing. That has really changed their focus to more, if we say no to you, could we defend it in a civil and administrative appeals tribunal? And that changes the onus very much from a show that you have all of your ducks lined up and that you absolutely, meet all of the criteria, more towards, are we going to have to turn ourselves into a pretzel to say no to you? And if we do, then maybe it's just better to say yes.
Yeah. And the process still requires a lot of effort on my behalf or the person's behalf to prove that what they have done is equivalent. But what's useful about it, I guess, is that you have to prove that it's equivalent, not that it's the same.
Yes.
So it doesn't have to be exactly the same. It just has to demonstrate similar competencies, and it's all linked to the APAC competencies.
And I think that's the really interesting thing for me, because when I look at the details of the Coulter case, and I can't bring the exact details to mind now, but she had sat in her training courses with clinical students, and she didn't have substantial equivalence. She had equivalence, just with a different name. But I think the precedent that has been set is now much more about, it's got to be substantively the same, and it's got to kind of line up with those APAC, the APAC matrix of what the the competencies and requirements are.
And I think, and I don't know what you remember, but I definitely remember there wasn't going to be endorsement. There was only going to be psychology. And it was, I believe, the Western Australia having the specialist title that actually started to advocate for, well, actually, we need something more than that. And so the default became the APS colleges. And in hindsight, what does that mean? Like, that's just, it's an interesting thing to reflect on. Like, what does it really mean in terms of we are so similar across all of us? And ultimately, what does that mean for a regulated profession, I guess?
Absolutely. Like it's always been an interesting, and this is not to throw shade on any of the smaller colleges, but I think the College of Community Psychologists has about 60 members. The college, the health psychologists have about 150 or whatever. The interest groups, the largest interest group, which is the child and family interest group, has about 6,000 members. So there's a real question as to, if you dig into the history of it, why are some things colleges and some things are interest groups? It's just about, was there a group of academics who created a master's program at some point in history and then attached a college to it? So a college is just a formalized version of an interest group in many ways.
Yeah.
It was always an interesting piece of pedagogic fiction that these things then turned into I think if they turned it into an actual specialization, I think that would have made a lot of sense. But I think just taking a college structure and saying, well, that's now a different thing is a very interesting.
It is. And I think that a lot of these things happen for convenience.
The history and convenience.
Yeah.
So jumping into the present. So I tend to read things, psychology related. So I knew about the Coulter case, but I guess I just imagined that this would correct a bit of a, historic injustice and, might apply to a couple of dozen people, maybe 100 people Australia wide. And then I guess this really came onto my radar actually about the same time that you and I started talking. So about 12 months ago. So for context, Kate and I started talking about this new prep product, this Ed and Dev prep stream, the Psychology Registrar Endorsement Program, if you just happen to be stumbling across this video and have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. So we started talking at that stage. And of course, we're interested in the market side of that. So, I reached out to some of the master's programs who are running Ed and Dev psychology master's programs, because obviously they are the type of students who we're interested in training this year and next year and every year going forward from here. And I was really surprised to find the number of them that were actually applying for dual registrar pathways right from the outset. So they had got their Ed and Dev, and then maybe one of their placements was in a child psychiatric facility, or maybe they'd taken an extra elective in something a bit clinical and they were putting in for dual registrar programs. And they were saying, so if we do the prep registrar program with you guys, will that help us get our clinical endorsement? And I realized, damn, I don't know the answer to that. So that's where our interest came through. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing for the students that again, it's all oral history at the moment.
It is. And a lot of it's online in the educational
the
developmental networking groups and stuff like that. I'm seeing a lot of people get through. Like, in fact, I would say more yes than no. The few people that can't get through tend to be ones where, like the couple of anecdotal stories I've heard, applying if your master's course didn't have placements. Now, I didn't even know that was a thing, but in the
I didn't know that was a thing, but thanks.
No, but in the mid 90s, apparently that some of them didn't have placements. So and they were still a master's. So again, cool, that's interesting. If the placements that you didn't address lifespan competency, or didn't address enough assessment competency or stuff like that. So if you didn't have enough variability within your placement options and things like that. Otherwise, if you've done certainly 4+2 and 5+1, no chance there. If you don't have a 2-year master's in another endorsement area, you won't get through on a clinical
That still seems to be there's the historic justice, injustice cases, like that. There's definitely some 4+2, and I hate to, use some numbers to describe a whole bunch of people, but there are some people who have 4+2 training, that is historic training, that have had careers that are clinical,
Yes.
who currently look like some of them are getting those endorsements approved. But what seems like a fairly simple pathway is if you've got a master's in X, and this is not just for clinical, obviously.
No, it's for anything. It's counselling. You can, if you're a clinical psych and you want to try and get a counselling psych endorsement or an ed and dev psych endorsement, you could try it that way too. Any direction.
Which does kind of open up the idea of what are the actual substantial differences between our, because when I look at the APAC requirements for clinical and counselling, and I don't mean this to offend either group, but I do struggle to disambiguate the two and to find, like, where is the point in the Venn diagram where they don't
Yeah.
And I think it's clearer with ed and dev, and it's clearer with neuro, and obviously
Neuro, I agree.
With org psych.
And maybe forensic as well. And like maybe there's some forensic things, like clinical to forensic, maybe not so much, but I feel like forensic to ed and dev, there feels like a bigger jump.
Well, you've had to put up with my insulting idea of getting rid of all 8 of the endorsements.
I know. I'm not anti it. I'm not anti it. I think there's something to be said for really rethinking the whole thing. Having said that, I still identify as an ed and dev, and I probably always will.
For those watching the video who haven't heard my soapbox about this, I believe we've only got 3 areas of specialization. Area 1 is treatment, and I think there's some forensic psychs who treat sex offenders and drug and alcohol, and I think there's some ed and dev psychs who treat developmental disorders, and there's some clinical and counselling psychs who provide treatment and psychotherapy. So that's group number 1. Group number 2 is assessment, and again, I think some clins do assessments, some forensics do assessments, some neuros, some ed and dev, some orgs, and actually the process of psychometric assessment and report writing has more in common between a forensic doing psychopathy assessments and a neuro doing dementia assessments than a forensic doing sex offender treatment versus a forensic doing psychopathy assessment. And then finally, I think we've got a systems group who, certainly within health psychology, there's some people who are working on public health and safety messaging, certainly within community psychology, certainly within organizational psychology. So there are 3 groups, actually, I think, is treatment, assessment, and systems. But that's an argument for another day. And as you say, there's a lot of identity. You see yourself as an ed and dev psych. I see myself as a clinical psych. We don't want to abandon that identity.
But as you say, like historically, and again, not wanting to harp back on history all the time, we're getting old, Aaron. It's about, these were interest areas. They were areas that people identified with and places that people worked rather than skills underlying them. So it's just an interesting kind of little world that we live in this space at the moment.
So what would you say, I guess, can I ask you to speak to a couple of different audiences? So audience number 1, you are coming to the end of an ed and dev pathway at the moment. Should you be looking at applying for, let's say clinical and ed and dev, or ed and dev and neuro? Like, is that something you would encourage people to have a crack at? Or do you think the paperwork's too much of a drama if it doesn't actually have a benefit?
In all honesty, I didn't think the paperwork was as hard as I thought it was going to be. So regardless of what stage of your career you're in, you have to basically prove, there's 2 parts that you have to prove. You have to prove that your training was equivalent to a clinical master's, and you have to prove that your period of supervised practice was equivalent to a pathway. So they're 2 different documents essentially. And AAPI has a lot of pro formas around those documents. So if you are an AAPI member, that I found that personally quite helpful. And you just have to unpack, and it's got some, how many hours did you do of this, of supervision and stuff like that, and how many hours did you work with clients, and how many hours was direct client contact and stuff like that. So you do have to have a bit of a record of some of your things, which is a bit harder the older you get, but Yeah.
Just on that front, if you are thinking of doing the prep program, please don't apply to us for your clinical equivalence, because this is entirely a SIBAR decision. You can do your registrar training with us. We will absolutely train you. But if you're a social worker, we would absolutely train you. Our training doesn't make you more able to get that clinical equivalence. But once you get the clinical equivalence, our training will meet all of the requirements to get your endorsement.
Yeah.
All right, so that's group number one. Group number two, what about old people like you and me? Would you encourage them to have a crack at it?
So I think that if you can demonstrate both of those pieces, then it can't hurt to try. And I guess there is some values and some advocacy elements to some of this kind of stuff. So I don't want to, be online recorded to say that I definitely think you need to do this to stuff up the system. But there's a little part of me that kind of believes, like really, if we're going to make change and we're going to see change, we have to do something to make that happen. And the more of us that do this, the more that it does demonstrate that the system isn't working the way it is. And actually the impact is, I think, most significant on our clients and on our clinical psychologists. I actually think that that's where the impact, even though it feels like it's everybody else, I actually think the biggest impact, even though clinical psychology has grown, I think, with all respect, of course, to everybody, is it's watering down what's actually there. And it's making it much harder. Like, people are going into clinical psychology. I've had plenty of students that I've supervised in different roles. That I've supervised clinical psychologists in training and profs who were doing clinical as well as ed and dev and 5+1s and all the rest. And what I find is people are choosing clinical psychologists because they're told that it's a better pathway, and they're told that that's going to give you greater opportunities and greater job opportunities and all the rest, and rebates and all that. But it's not like the clinical psychology is supposed to, if we look at purely what is clinical psychologist supposed to be doing, it's about a certain group of clients and a certain group of presentations and a certain environment that you want to work in. And that's not going to suit everybody, and it shouldn't suit everybody. So the rebate shouldn't be the decision.
Absolutely.
For why you choose that.
The word clinical comes from the Greek klinos, which means bedside. Which means that's the work that we're doing. So if you're doing clinical psychology because you want the higher rebate, I agree with Kate completely. That's the wrong decision. If you're doing clinical psychology because you're interested in serious mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar, eating disorder, the things that are at the pointy end of the DSM, I think if that interests you and that's a group of people who you have a passion for, that certainly, that at least for me is more consistent intellectually and at a values level. So that was the third group that I was going to ask you to speak to. Now you just finished your honours degree last year, and you've got good grades, and you interview well, you're very personable, you're going to go and have a crack at a master's. What would you recommend that you do?
I mean, I feel like that flows on really easily from what I've just said. Like, find what do you like? What do you enjoy? Pick the masters that you enjoy. And pick the area that you want to work in. And sure, I'd love everybody to go and do ed and dev, but it's not going to suit everybody.
And not other than the area that is perceived as being the status area or the money area, or whatever.
Because I do think I maybe I'm naive, maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I do think that the system is going to have to catch up. Whether it's 2 years down the track or 5 years down the track, I really believe that the system is going to have to figure this out, and the government's going to have to adjust what's happening in Medicare somewhere along the way. Because I don't think that this is sustainable long term, and I think that that's where our advocacy needs to be, because I do think that if we were able to shift that Medicare part, that everything else would naturally then flow down, and we would get a more equivalency around all of us, and we would all feel so much better around what's happening, and people would get what they need more, and people would get psychologists that were trained to support them in the way that they need to be supported. Ultimately, if you were doing fourth year, do what you love.
That's fantastic, Kate. I really appreciate you not only sharing the story there, but also just going through the steps of it and getting a sense of what it actually looks like and what the real world implications are, without us getting too political and getting too much up on our soapboxes. I think it's really great to actually hear that story and I guess the impact that it's had on you. For anyone who would like to get to know Kate better, obviously you have joined up with the prep team and you're going to be, I think you're doing half a dozen, maybe not half a dozen, but you're definitely doing a handful of workshops for us this year, and you're going to be supervising.
Yes, I'm very excited.
We're really excited too. I think this is good for our clins to get expert supervision and training from people with highly qualified and highly experienced in ed and dev. And I hope that it's just as good for the ed and devs to be getting that training and support from a bunch of clins. So I'm hoping this is a fruitful collaboration between the two of us. But just on the focus of today, I really appreciate you sharing that story and the wisdom and the information, because I think it's really needed out there.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you being so open to hearing all of that stuff too, because I think that's the really important part is that we need to have clinical psychologists having these conversations and being open to having those conversations and doing them publicly, because we all need to be working together on it. It's impacting everyone.
That's okay. I'll see how the hate mail in my email goes from my clinical colleague. No, I'm kidding.
I know you are.
All righty. Thank you so much, Kate. I really appreciate your time.